Hey guys, tonight we slip behind the embroidered curtains of an ancient Chinese wedding chamber, a space steeped in mystery, symbolism and secrets wrapped in layers of red silk. Imagine the flickering oil lamps casting warm glows across carved wooden panels, while a gauzy red veil hangs over the bridal bed like a soft mist of expectation. The air is thick with incense, amber and sandalwood, and somewhere in the distance a bamboo flute plays a tune slow enough to lull even the anxious heart. But don't get too cozy just yet. You're about to witness traditions that make the phrase "till death do us part" feel more like a delicate warning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wedding chamber of ancient China wasn't simply a room. It was an orchestrated stage designed as carefully as a temple. Red, glorious, enveloping red was everywhere. Red curtains, red bed linens, red undergarments embroidered with gold thread. Even the chamber pots, if you must know, were sometimes painted in auspicious crimson. Red symbolized luck, protection and joy, but also served as a subtle shield against spirits that supposedly lurked around transitions like marriage, birth and death. And a wedding night. That was all three at once. As the bride stepped into the room, her face hidden behind a red silk veil, she often did so with tiny, deliberate steps. Shoes embroidered with lotuses or mandarin ducks touched the polished floor as if afraid to make a sound. Her dowry might already be placed neatly inside ornate wooden chests against the walls, silent witnesses to the path ahead. In wealthier homes, the furniture in the room would be lacquered in deep cinnabar tones with phoenix and dragon motifs etched in bone or gold leaf. These weren't just decorations, they were coded expectations. The phoenix in particular represented the bride, beautiful, mystical, capable of soaring into divine realms. The dragon was the groom, strong, wise and dominant. Together they created a union that balanced yin and yang. That union was expected to begin right here under the red canopy with ancestral tablets, perhaps watching from a quiet altar nearby. No pressure. Most wedding beds were not modest. If anything, they screamed fertility. The bedding often featured bold designs, peonies for prosperity, pomegranates, bursting with seeds, pairs of butterflies fluttering toward each other. Everything pointed to the same end: children, preferably sons, and quickly. In some regions, a small bowl of lotus seeds and red dates would be placed discreetly at the foot of the bed, an edible blessing meant to whisper, "May you give birth early to a noble son." Crunchy, symbolic and slightly chewy, just like expectations, the bride meanwhile might be sweating under her veil. It wasn't just nerves. Those veils could be stifling. They weren't made for comfort, but for transformation. Covering the face was a way to protect the bride from evil spirits who might snatch her beauty during the liminal moment between maidenhood and wifehood. It also served a more terrestrial function, prolonging the mystery. The groom couldn't lift it until just the right moment sometimes, not until she was already seated on the bed. In some traditions, he used a ceremonial stick or a fan. It was meant to be symbolic, but let's be honest, fumbling with a veil in low light is rarely graceful. The room wasn't always private. In smaller households, especially in rural villages, the wedding chamber might be adjacent to the main room where family still bustled about. Sometimes it was separated only by a hanging screen or beaded curtain. Whispers could travel through walls, and every creak of the floorboards might have been a younger sibling sneaking a peek. In wealthier homes, where space allowed for discretion, the chambers were lavish and more isolated, but that didn't mean the couple was alone. And let's not forget what lay beneath the silk sheets. The mattress was often stuffed with aromatic herbs, mugwort, chrysanthemum, sometimes even lavender, if it had been traded in from the west. Not just for the scent, mind you. These herbs were believed to calm nerves, stimulate passion, or at the very least deter insects. Practicality wrapped in poetry, as most ancient Chinese traditions were. Then there was the bedding itself, an object of extreme care. Mothers, aunts, and professional matchmakers took part in selecting the sheets. It had to be smooth silk, never cotton, and stitched with threads dyed from natural plants. Sometimes tiny bells or tassels were attached at the corners to ward off demons. And yes, it made every small movement sound like a performance, a rustle of silk, a jingle of metal, a murmur of something beginning. By now the couple might be sitting stiffly side by side on the edge of the bed. Not touching, not speaking, just two heavily adorned strangers inhaling incense smoke and social obligation. The groom was expected to make the first move, offering wine, cracking a mild joke or quoting a poem if he was the scholarly type. Pluck the lotus from the pond, he might say, which depending on the tone could sound either romantic or wildly inappropriate. Historians still argue whether these poetic advances were truly spontaneous, or just recited like school scripts. In some regions, the first thing the bride and groom did together in that room wasn't what you're thinking it was eating. A ceremonial bowl of sweet soup or sticky rice balls. It wasn't sexy, but it was symbolic. Sharing food meant sharing life, and chewing in awkward silence was often easier than facing the mountain of expectations behind the door. Of course not, everything in the chamber was visible. Tucked away behind a screen or hidden in a lacquered box were family tokens, heirloom combs, embroidered sachets filled with herbs, maybe even a jade pendant believed to bless the bed. These items were private spiritual and occasionally used as quiet psychological armour by brides who felt like guests at their own weddings. And sometimes the red colour wasn't enough to cover the dread. Stories passed from cousin to cousin, aunt to niece hinted at things that weren't said aloud. The risk of displeasure, the fear of inadequacy, the lurking suspicion that the groom might already have someone else, an older lover, a concubine, a ghost bride from childhood promise. The wedding chamber was a stage, yes, but not always one where the bride chose her role. Still the room shimmered with hope. If luck held, the crimson canopy would become a safe roof over new beginnings. The red sheets would be washed in the morning sun, hung to dry beside neighbours who whispered guesses. The phoenix would rise, the dragon would roar, and by the time Reese was served again, a new family might just be taking root. The bed wasn't just a bed. It was a dynasty in miniature, a carved, lacquered statement of everything the family hoped and feared about the union. In ancient China, especially among the elite or merchant classes, the marriage bed was often commissioned months, sometimes years in advance, and custom built by skilled artisans who specialised in nuptial furniture. Its massive frame, usually hewn from fragrant woods like camphor or rosewood, stood like a throne room inside the wedding chamber. Often the bed had 3 enclosed sides and a low canopy, creating the illusion of a room within a room, a chamber behind a veil of curtains and carved lattices. And if the couple didn't fall in love well, at least the bed looked like they did. Take one step closer and you'd see the intricate carvings, dragons entwined with phoenix's vines, sprouting pomegranates, peonies blossoming in every corner. Nothing was random. The dragon, the eternal masculine force, spiraled round the post to meet the phoenix's equal in celestial femininity. Together they weren't just lovers, they were cosmic balance. Their union symbolised power, fertility and longevity, making them the central mascots of any respectable wedding bed. Sometimes these creatures were gilded with real gold leaf or inlaid with mother of pearl, catching the glow of candlelight with quiet authority. Sleep, sure, but not before being stared down by a menagerie of symbolic animals reminding you to do your family duty. The bedding itself echoed these ambitions. Layer upon layer of silk quilts embroidered with crimson thread lay folded with precise symmetry. If you peeked beneath the top cover, you might find additional layers with motifs meant only for the couple's eyes, like a hidden love poem stitched in delicate characters, or the bride's name worked into a corner by her mother. This was a language of symbols passed down through generations of women who may have known the bed more intimately than their husbands. Some households even had a bed poem, a phrase embroidered across the headboard like a quiet commandment. One popular line read, "Harmony of heaven and earth begins here." Slightly dramatic, but that's marriage for you. Then there were the side panels. Oh, the panels. These weren't just decorative. In many households they were removable, allowing for modesty or exposure depending on the audience. Imagine being a young couple in a room where the bed could be opened like a stage curtain or closed like a confession booth. In some traditions, the mother-in-law would ceremoniously close the panels after inspecting the bed, an act both awkward and highly symbolic. Once the curtains were drawn, they remained that way until the morning light, when someone, usually not the couple, would open them again. Because in ancient China, even privacy needed a witness. Now, the real masterpiece was often the canopy. Hanging low over the couple's heads, it wasn't just cloth. It was a ceiling of hopes, made from embroidered silk or gauze, often dyed the same deep red as the rest of the chamber. The canopy was usually decorated with celestial imagery, stars, clouds, or cranes flying in pairs. Cranes, you see, were believed to mate for life, so naturally they were embroidered in pairs, gazing toward one another, beaks nearly touching. Romantic, yes, but also a gentle threat: don't mess this up. In wealthier homes, the bed sat on a raised platform with a small step or stool carved just for the bride. This served a dual purpose. First, it allowed onlookers, yes onlookers, to witness the bride being helped onto the bed, a moment considered both tender and theatrical. Second, it made her literally look up to her new station. After all, in Confucian households, marriage wasn't just about love. It was a carefully arranged transfer of roles, duty and hierarchy. Historians still argue whether the elevation of the bed was meant to honour the couple, or to remind them that everyone else was watching from below. In some regions, the bed was accompanied by 2 standing lanterns on either side, known as dragonfire and phoenix flame. Lit by oil and often perfumed with jasmine or musk, they burned through the night and were believed to guide the ancestors' spirits who might drop by to check on the new branch of the family tree. Nothing like performing under supernatural supervision. The smoke curled upward toward the canopy, where it mingled with perfume sachets hung like ornaments, little pouches filled with cloves, star anise, and sometimes dried orange peel. These were gifts from the bride's family, hand-sewn for protection and fertility, or more practically to cover up any less auspicious odours. Even the placement of the bed followed rules. It had to face a specific direction, often south, which was considered auspicious, like pointing the couple towards sunlight and growth. Placing it facing west, on the other hand, was avoided in many areas, something to do with shadows and misfortune. But the real curse was facing a mirror. A bed that reflected itself was said to divide the couple's luck in half. So any mirrors in the room were usually covered with silk scarves until morning. You don't want bad feng shui on your first night together. That's practically asking for a marital cold front. And it wasn't all just for show. In wealthier homes, there might even be secret compartments built into the headboard, or side drawers used to store heirloom jewellery, family documents, or the occasional emergency contraceptive herbs. Yes, those existed. The bed became not only a place of union, but a vault, a hiding spot, a container of private legacy. Some of these beds were passed down through generations, the wooden frames growing darker with age, the carvings softening with time but never losing their stories. A new couple might sleep in the same frame where a grandmother once sobbed into her wedding night pillow. Talk about haunted history. If the bride was lucky, the bed was new. If not, it was second-hand, shared like a whispered secret from sister to sister, or mother to daughter-in-law. Some brides whispered silent prayers into the wood before climbing in, asking it to forget what it had witnessed before. Others added charms, jade bangles, red threads, even coins tied to the legs of the bed to buy good fortune. One quirky tradition involved tucking a carved wooden rooster under the mattress. Why, because roosters chase away evil spirits, or maybe just because no one wants a quiet bird on their wedding night. So as you lie there beneath the red canopy on a bed carved by generations and watched over by embroidered beasts and flickering lanterns, you might wonder if you're really alone. You're not. The dynasty sleeps with you quietly, heavily, and always expectantly. The veil was never just fabric. It was a barrier, a secret, a ritual in its own right. Made of bright red silk, often sheer enough to blur the contours of her face, but never clear enough to reveal it. The bridal veil was worn from the moment she left her home until well after she was seated on the wedding bed. It fluttered like flame as she was carried in a red palanquin escorted by firecrackers, symbols and the occasional nervous goat sacrificed for luck. Beneath it she could barely see, barely breathe, and certainly not speak freely. And that was the point. This wasn't a garment, it was a transition zone. When the couple entered the wedding chamber, the groom was forbidden from lifting the veil too soon. Timing mattered. In many traditions, he had to wait until both were seated side by side on the edge of the bed, shoulders not touching hands, neatly placed on their knees like school children pretending to behave. Only then could he reach for the veil, but not with his bare hands. That would be too intimate, too forward. Instead, he would use a ritual object, most often a carved stick known as the rui rod, shaped like a curved, wish-granting scepter. It wasn't just ceremony, it was code for I'm entering this marriage with respect, and maybe a little fear. The moment was laced with tension. Would he smile or flinch? Would she blush or smirk? Legend says that some brides wore makeup so thick and pale that their skin resembled porcelain with tiny crimson dots at the corners of their eyes to ward off evil. In dim candlelight, her face might appear ghostly surreal, like a doll carved from lotus root. One fringed tale from the Tang dynasty describes a groom fainting when he lifted the veil and realized the bride was cross-eyed. Historians still argue whether this was true or simply a poetic exaggeration. Either way, first impressions carried the weight of dynastic futures, and sometimes the veil didn't come off immediately at all. In certain regions, particularly in older customs preserved in rural areas, the bride was expected to remain veiled through the entire evening, yes, even in bed. Only when the lights were out and the room empty could the veil be discreetly removed. It was said that a bride who removed it too early risked offending the spirits of the ancestors, or worse, her in-laws. That sort of mistake could earn years of gossip, and no one wants to be the subject of gossip in a multi-generational household, where walls are paper thin and Reese is always eaten in silence. In more playful households, the groom had to earn the right to see her face. A popular game involved the bride hiding her face behind a painted fan, refusing to show herself, until the groom correctly answered 3 riddles. These weren't easy. They were often abstract metaphors involving plum blossoms, moonlight, or obscure Confucian wordplay. One riddle reportedly asked what flower blooms without rain yet cries when touched. The answer was a blushing bride. Sweet if you're into poetic puzzles, but imagine the pressure if you got it wrong and the fan never lowered. The veil also served a psychological purpose. For the bride who might never have seen her husband clearly until that very day, it offered a last sliver of anonymity. It was a pause before total exposure, before her entire identity was handed over to a new family, and often a new household rank. Remember, in Confucian tradition, a woman was expected to obey her father before marriage, her husband afterward, and her son in widowhood. The veil was the last fabric she wore for herself, and yet for all its symbolic gravity, the moment of unveiling was also intimate, a tiny ceremony within a giant one. In wealthier homes, a handmaid might gently dim the lanterns right before the veil was lifted, creating a softer light so the bride wouldn't be startled. The groom, hands trembling, might fumble with the rui stick, accidentally tugging her hair or brushing her cheek. Those accidental touches often said more than hours of scripted wedding banter. And if he smiled, that was a good omen. If he looked confused, well, you could always blame the lighting. Not every veil was the same. Brides from different regions sported different styles. Some veils were thin like gauze, embroidered with golden threads in the shape of birds or lotuses. Others were thick, heavy panels that draped all the way to the waist like a curtain drawn over a sacred painting. In the south there were even double veils, an inner one to hide the face, and an outer one to please the gods. It was said that if the veil fluttered while being lifted, it was the breath of the ancestors giving their blessing, or a badly placed window. In rare cases, the unveiling became a spectacle. Certain noble families allowed close relatives or trusted advisors to witness it as a gesture of transparency. One Ming Dynasty record describes a chamber where a translucent screen was placed between the couple and a watching grandmother. She observed the unveiling while sipping lotus tea and nodding slowly. Whether this was charming or mortifying depends entirely on your tolerance for multi-generational intimacy. But the idea was clear: marriage wasn't a private act, it was a public trust. Yet even this fragile moment wasn't safe from politics. Some veils were lifted under duress. Brides chosen through arranged marriages, often for political alliances or family debts, could barely hide their apprehension. Their smiles were sometimes sewn onto their faces earlier in the day by aunties armed with rouge and high expectations, and the grooms, they were often too young or too drunk to appreciate the delicacy of the moment. One record from the Song dynasty recalls a groom who accidentally lit the veil on fire with a candle. The bride slapped him. They stayed married for 50 years. Still, if everything went well, if the veil lifted smoothly, the bride smiled and the groom didn't faint or drop the rouillé stick, it was considered a powerful blessing. A smooth unveiling foretold smooth relations, smooth pregnancies, smooth harvests. Everything in ancient China, it seems, could be linked to smoothness. And if there was awkwardness, that too was folded into the story. Couples laughed about it years later, sitting on the same bed beneath a new canopy, watching their children sleep beneath the same embroidered dragons. In the end, the veil was just a piece of fabric, but for one moment it held centuries of expectation, tradition, superstition, and shy curiosity. And as it slipped away, so too did the last layer of uncertainty, leaving behind a pair of strangers blinking under the same red canopy with a whole life yet to be lived. It's easy to assume the wedding chamber was a private space two newlyweds alone, at last surrounded by flickering candlelight and the soft rustle of silk. But ancient Chinese wedding nights were rarely that private. Lurking just outside the embroidered curtains behind folding screens or beaded dividers were people, actual breathing, listening people, elder servants, matchmakers, and on occasion a nosy cousin pretending to refill the oil lamps. The chamber may have been closed, but it was never sealed. In many households, particularly those clinging to Confucian ideals, the consummation of a marriage wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a family event, albeit one that was supposed to be delicately monitored. The act itself wasn't witnessed, at least not usually, but the atmosphere was monitored like a lunar eclipse. Did the groom fumble too long? Did the bride cry? Did the candles go out too early? All these signs were interpreted and discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors, or not so hushed tones if the wine had been generous that evening. One of the more awkward roles was assigned to the witness matron, usually a senior female relative or a professional, hired by the bride's family. Her duty was to stay close, often behind a curtain or screen during the early moments of the night. Not to stare, thank goodness, but to be available in case the bride had questions or fears. In theory, she offered support. In practice, she loomed like a censor with a fan. Her presence was meant to provide comfort and ensure ritual purity, but it also ensured that any misstep would be immediately reported to the breakfast table the next morning. Sometimes there was no screen at all, just distance. In smaller homes, the wedding chamber was adjacent to shared living spaces. Grandparents might be playing mahjong a few paces away, pretending to ignore the muffled giggles or the suspicious silence from behind the red curtains. Younger siblings were shooed away, but they still tiptoed past with exaggerated curiosity, sometimes leaving offerings of peanuts or jujubes by the doorway. It was believed that the snacks encouraged fertility. Whether they also served as bribes to nosy children is open to interpretation. In some elite households, particularly during the Tang and Song dynasties, the surveillance was formalized. The bedchamber would include a tall screen carved from sandalwood or bamboo that separated the bed from the rest of the room. Behind this screen, a chaperone might sit quietly sipping tea and counting the minutes. No one said what they were waiting to hear. A squeak of the bed frame, a whispered poem, a dramatic thud followed by an apology. Whatever it was, the chaperone recorded it mentally for the family's informal archive of how the night went. The reasoning behind all this observation stemmed from two things: lineage and honour. A marriage wasn't just a union between two people, it was a contract between two families, often negotiated for months or years, and cemented not with ink but with children. The faster a bride proved her fertility, the more valuable she became in the household hierarchy. So the wedding night had to happen promptly and ideally successfully. The family needed signs, and short of installing a Confucian surveillance camera, a human witness was the next best thing. Now let's talk about sound. With walls made of wood or clay brick and windows covered with rice paper, sound travelled easily through ancient homes. A squeaky mattress, an awkward laugh, even the rustle of the bridal veil hitting the floor, it all floated through the house like incense smoke. This meant discretion wasn't just advised, it was practically impossible. Brides were often told to suppress their voices, while grooms were encouraged to maintain masculine composure, a term that probably didn't mean what they thought it did. Some families had traditions to mask these sounds. Drums might be played softly in the outer hall, or musicians hired to perform gentle zither music during the first hour of the wedding night. In one particularly poetic account from the Ming dynasty, a groom hired a flute player to stand beneath the window of the chamber and perform love songs until the candle burned halfway down. He later claimed the music gave him performance anxiety. The musician apparently got a raise, and yet not all observers were passive. There are records, uncomfortable but real, of families inspecting the bed the next morning. The infamous blood-stained sheet custom, often dramatised in fiction, was practised in certain regions, particularly among conservative rural families. A piece of white cloth or handkerchief was placed discreetly under the bride before consummation. Come morning it was quietly examined and sometimes even paraded through the household, much to everyone's horror. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread norm or an exaggerated practice limited to a few zealous households. But either way, the fear of it was real. It's no wonder that some couples postponed intimacy until a later night, pretending exhaustion or illness, just to reclaim a shred of privacy. Others snuck off in the early morning hours to a more secluded space, a garden pavilion, a granary loft, places where no screens lurked, and no great-aunt was holding her breath behind a partition. Of course, this delayed consummation came with its own set of rumours. Why wait, people whispered. Did something go wrong because in ancient China silence didn't mean peace? It meant speculation. Still, among all the awkwardness, there were moments of grace. A bride might receive a quiet nod from the matron the next morning, a silent signal that she had passed an unspoken test. A groom might be clapped on the back by his uncles at breakfast, offered an extra egg in his rice porridge. It was crude, yes, but in its own way it was a welcome to adulthood, an acknowledgement that the night was over, the rituals complete, and the next chapter, pregnancy, inheritance, managing the family pigsty, could begin. And for all the anxiety the surveillance brought, there was one unexpected benefit. Many couples, especially arranged matches, formed their first inside joke from that very experience. Later in life, they'd smile over tea and whisper, "Remember your aunt behind the curtain," or "You dropped the wine cup and she gasped like we'd summoned a demon." Shared awkwardness, after all, is its own kind of intimacy. So the next time you picture an ancient wedding night, don't imagine candlelit romance in complete seclusion. Imagine the red silk canopy fluttering slightly as someone stifles a sneeze from behind a screen. Imagine footsteps retreating down the hallway as the oil lamp dims. And imagine two young people, under all that pressure and scrutiny, learning to laugh quietly, of course. Before she ever stepped onto the wedding bed, the ancient Chinese bride had already been thoroughly briefed, sometimes gently, sometimes alarmingly, on what was expected of her, behind that embroidered curtain. These instructions didn't arrive all at once. They were dripped like honey into her ears over the months leading up to the wedding, then poured like vinegar during the last few hours before she donned her red veil. Mothers, aunts, grandmothers, and professional matchmakers each had a turn, offering a rotating cast of euphemisms and unsolicited wisdom. One whispered about honouring the dragon, another warned her never to cry on the bed unless it was for joy. And tucked beneath a stack of hairpins and handkerchiefs in her dowry chest, often wrapped in red string, might be a scroll or folded booklet detailing precisely how to handle the wedding night. These weren't instructional manuals in the modern sense. There were no diagrams or helpful step-by-step illustrations. Instead, they read like poetry trapped in a rulebook. Lines such as "the phoenix must not flutter before the dragon breathes" were supposed to make sense. And if they didn't, well, that was what the aunties were for. The most well-known of these guides, sometimes called nuje, or female precepts, covered everything from table manners to bedroom posture. They blended Confucian values with folk tradition, always emphasizing obedient silence and grace under pressure. Imagine being handed a sacred scroll that basically said, "Smile, nod, endure quietly." It was enough to make a phoenix molt. One of the most curious bedtime items in a bride's chamber was the fan. Not the kind you wave lazily during summer heat, but a soft silk-covered fan embroidered with lucky symbols like bats for fortune and peaches for longevity. It had a role in the wedding night, though interpretations varied. In some regions, the bride held the fan to cover her face even after the veil was lifted, an extra layer of mystery. In others, the fan was used to cool the heat of shyness, an awkward euphemism repeated by elderly women with knowing smiles. Occasionally the fan was passed from bride to groom as a symbolic invitation, its silk slats fluttering like nerves. Even stranger was the custom of pressure point guidance. Passed down orally or scribbled onto yellowed slips of paper, these techniques claimed to enhance harmony and pleasure, or at least minimize embarrassment. A gentle press behind the earlobe, a soft touch at the base of the spine. Press like brushing peach blossom, one note might say, as though that clarified anything. Of course, most of these instructions were useless without experience, which no one was supposed to admit they had. But the illusion of preparation provided a form of comfort, a ritual armour for the uncertainty to come. For brides of noble birth, these instructions could be delivered by professional tutors, older women hired to educate girls in the arts of feminine virtue. These tutors were often called Mother Tan or Granny Lian titles that made them sound harmless, almost grandmotherly. But their lessons were sharp. Don't speak unless asked, they'd say. Don't laugh too loud, or the groom will think you're mocking him. One record from the Song dynasty notes a bride who was instructed to cough 3 times if the groom moved too quickly, and to hum if he was doing well. That wasn't awkward at all. For the groom there were scrolls too, but fewer and with a vastly different tone. While brides were told to be passive, groom instructions often encouraged firm confidence and disciplined assertiveness, which sounds suspiciously like a martial arts training manual. One preserved text from the Qing dynasty even instructed approach like a general crossing a river, with strategy but without hesitation. Whether that general had any idea what he was doing is up for debate. Still, the double standard was clear: the groom must lead. The bride must gracefully follow, even if neither had the faintest idea where they were going. Among common folk, these scrolls were often replaced with whispered advice, and a few symbolic items tucked into the dowry. A pair of Mandarin duck figurines always facing each other might sit beside the bed, believed to encourage loyalty. A sachet of dried longan fruit and lotus seeds might rest beneath the pillow, symbols of fertility and sweetness. One especially quirky tradition involved drawing the Chinese character for double happiness on the inside of the bride's palm using a chicken feather dipped in wine. This was done just before she entered the wedding chamber. The ink would fade, but the gesture remained a secret blessing hidden in the folds of her hand. Sometimes the scrolls weren't meant for the couple at all, but for the matron watching from behind the screen. In these cases, the content was less about technique and more about timing and ritual. Let the bride enter first. Close the curtain on the 3rd step. Remove her shoes, but not her anklets. Every action had to follow a script or risk bad fortune. And if the couple stumbled over a step, say the groom dropped the wine cup or the bride stepped in with her left foot first, the matron was expected to gently correct them, or in more serious cases delay the entire act until the right omens appeared. But scrolls and instructions, no matter how poetic, couldn't eliminate the human awkwardness of it all. One record from the Han Dynasty recounts a bride who panicked mid-ritual and hid under the bed, refusing to come out. Another tale tells of a groom who drank too much ginseng wine and fell asleep fully clothed, leaving the bride to sit awake beside a tray of untouched desserts. Stories like these were rarely written in official records, but they were preserved in family lore whispered between generations as both warning and comedy. And the lesson, even the most elaborate instructions couldn't script sincerity. Despite their tone, many of the bedtime scrolls ended with soft affirmations. Lines like, "A harmonious union brings light to the home," or "Two hearts wrapped in one red thread will weather all storms." These weren't rules, they were hopes. And when the lights dimmed and the observers retreated, sometimes the scroll stayed open, read again by candlelight, not for clarity but for comfort. Because even if you followed every instruction perfectly, the truth remained: love wasn't guaranteed. Only the effort was. So the bride clutched her embroidered fan. The groom stared at the unread scroll on his table, and between them the bed waited still scarlet and surrounded by generations of hopes that rustled like paper in the dark. Just when the newlyweds thought they might finally have a moment to themselves, candles flickering, fans gently waving, awkward silence fully bloomed, there came a polite cough from behind the curtain. Enter the helpful matron, or more accurately, the most uncomfortably attentive presence one could possibly imagine on their wedding night. She wasn't a ghost, although she drifted in and out of the shadows like one. She wasn't a parent, although she might scold you like one. She was something else entirely, a ceremonial relic with a fan in one hand, a knowing smirk in the other, and a lifetime of wedding stories under her sash. In many regions of ancient China, especially during the Tang Song and Ming dynasties, this matron often referred to as the Xinyang Po, or joyous old woman, was considered as essential to the wedding night as the bed itself. She was typically an older widow, respected for both her discretion and her assumed neutrality. After all, a woman who had already fulfilled her wifely and maternal duties was seen as the perfect guide into this sacred threshold. Think of her as a combination of wedding planner, relationship coach, and etiquette enforcer, all in a single hovering figure who refused to blink. Her job was delicate, though not always subtle. First and foremost, she was there to ensure that ritual purity and symbolic steps were properly completed. Did the groom sit before the bride did? Did the wine cups clink at the correct angle? Was the left shoe removed before the right one? These weren't trivialities, they were omens. Misstep now, and you might find yourself blamed for next season's poor harvest. And if that seems extreme, remember in households where astrology and ancestor worship mingled with daily life, nothing was left to chance. But the matron's role didn't stop at ritual choreography. She was also there for emotional support. Not the tender tear-wiping kind you'd hope for, but the don't embarrass your grandmother kind. If a bride trembled too much, the matron would offer her a sugar cube soaked in rice wine. If the groom's hand shook, she'd casually remind him that even Confucius had a first night. And if the couple looked absolutely paralysed by terror, she might joke, "Well, we can always bring the rooster in to demonstrate. That one always got nervous laughs unless someone actually brought in a rooster." One of her signature moves was the symbolic guidance. This could take the form of lighting the red bedroom candles and then carefully adjusting their flames to ensure they burned evenly, an omen for marital harmony. Or she might tie a red thread loosely around the couple's wrists, encouraging them to break it together at just the right moment. In some traditions, she would even hand the groom a tiny sachet of ground ginseng, or deer antler powder, nodding solemnly like a sorceress passing on sacred power. Whether it worked or not was never her problem. Her job was symbolism, performance, and keeping the awkwardness running on schedule. She also kept time, not in minutes but in phases. There was the entry phase, the tea-sharing phase, the silence before the curtain phase. Each step had to unfold like a carefully orchestrated drama. The matron would sit behind a folding screen or a gauzy silk curtain close enough to intervene far enough to preserve the illusion of privacy. And if there was laughter, she recorded it mentally. If there was a loud crash, she pretended not to hear, but rest assured by sunrise she would know everything. The helpful matron had ears sharper than a fox and the memory of a bamboo tablet. Sometimes she even stayed the night. Not in the bed, of course, let's not be scandalous, but in the adjoining room or on a mat outside the door, just in case. Just in case the bride fainted. Just in case the groom ran out for water and never came back. Just in case one of the family elders decided to peek in and needed to be intercepted. Her presence was less about suspicion and more about safeguarding the timeline. A successful wedding night meant more than just a consummated union. It meant stability, continuity, and good fortune. And if she had to sleep upright in a lacquered chair to guarantee it, so be it. The role came with perks. The matron was usually paid in silver coins, bolts of silk, or in particularly generous families a carved jade ornament. She might also receive leftovers from the wedding feast, duck rice cakes, candied lotus root. But what she treasured most was the gossip. Oh, the gossip. She collected stories like talismans stored in the folds of her memory for years. That one bride tripped over her own shoes. That one groom sneezed and spilled the wine into her lap. She never used names. Of course, discretion was part of the package, but her stories served as entertainment and gentle warnings to future couples. You didn't want to be remembered in one of her tales. Not every matron was beloved. Some were too stern, too invasive. Brides whispered about matrons who scolded them mid-embrace, or who tugged the curtain aside to adjust a pillow for better balance. One infamous account from the Qing dynasty tells of a matron who fell asleep behind the screen and snored so loudly the couple couldn't concentrate. Another record describes a matron who gave unsolicited advice from behind the curtain, like a ghost with opinions. Not like that, try the right hand. Whether she was helpful or horrifying depended largely on her tone and her ability to mind her own business. Still, many brides found unexpected comfort in her presence. She was after all one of the few women in the house who had survived the very ritual now unfolding. When the world expected perfect obedience, perfect modesty, perfect transitions from girl to wife, the helpful matron at least offered a knowing glance. She knew the wedding night wasn't always magic. Sometimes it was awkward. Sometimes it was disappointing. Sometimes it was just weird, and her gentle presence ridiculous as it could be served as a reminder you weren't alone in navigating the strange theatre of marriage. As dawn approached and the red candles burned low, the helpful matron would gather her things, a fan, a sachet of incense, her notes written in her mind, and quietly slip away. She wouldn't say much, maybe just a low chuckle or a cryptic, "That went well enough." Her departure was timed with the soft chirping of birds and the muted bustle of the household waking up. She left behind silent silk that smelled faintly of the herbs and two people blinking at each other across a rumpled bed. The curtain fell. The role ended. But the memory of her hovering presence that lingered far longer than anyone cared to admit. Before the veil lifted, before the helpful matron cleared her throat for the third time, and long before the red canopy saw any action, there was the wine. Not just any wine, mind you. This was wedding night wine, infused, prepared and served with the kind of reverence usually reserved for ancient spells or expensive tea. Every household had its own version, often passed down through maternal lines with barely veiled giggles. It wasn't just a drink. It was a potion, a psychological booster, and sometimes a mild gamble with digestion. The base of this magical brew was always rice wine, fragrant golden and slightly sweet. But the real action was in what floated inside. Ginseng roots curled like sleeping dragons, their tips dipped in folklore and promises. Goji berries, small red jewels, bobbed near the surface, swelling with the warmth of the liquid. Sometimes slices of angelica root or a stray jujube would sneak in too, just in case the stars needed an extra push. A typical cup smelled like a medicinal garden on fire, and tasted like someone had steeped ambition in sugar water. But tradition insisted it worked, so couples sipped it anyway, trying not to make faces. For the bride, the wine was meant to calm nerves and warm the womb, a charming phrase that made her feel more like an oven than a person. For the groom, it was said to stoke the fire-boost stamina and awaken the dragon. Some scrolls even suggested reciting poetry while drinking to harmonise the gsirs, though most newlyweds were too nervous to remember their own names, let alone couplets. And if the groom downed 3 cups in a row, he was either very confident or about to pass out with extreme elegance. Historians still argue whether the ritual actually helped, or just made people smell vaguely like soup. Not all wines were created equal. In more superstitious regions, the concoction included peculiar ingredients, ground antler dried seahorse, even the occasional preserved gecko. Yes, gecko. Dried and curled like a question mark, it was believed to enhance male potency. That's one way to start a conversation. Some families even had their wine blessed by a Taoist priest before the wedding, who chanted over the bubbling pot like a sorcerer with a side hustle in hospitality. The priest would dip a peach branch into the wine, flicking droplets around the room for good fortune and firm resolve. Try explaining that with a straight face. The timing of the wine was critical. It wasn't served too early lest the couple grow sleepy before anything started, and not too late lest awkwardness solidify into stone. Often the bride and groom would share a symbolic cup first, linked by a red ribbon or gold-threaded cloth. This act, called the Ju or union wine, was meant to bind their fates together. They would sip facing each other, their arms, lightly intertwined eyes darting everywhere except into one another's. The wine was usually lukewarm by this point, but no one seemed to mind. What mattered was the ritual, the performance, the gesture of beginning something irreversible with a sip. After the ceremonial cup came the optional second round, a more robust dose served in separate bowls. This was the real wine, the one dosed with herbs and hopeful magic. It was also the one more likely to produce a cough, a blush, or a sudden desire to sit down. In wealthier homes, the wine was served in porcelain cups etched with mandarin ducks or lotus flowers. In poorer households, bamboo cups were used light, disposable, and always slightly splintery at the rim. The symbolism remained intact. Either way, drink this and you drink your future. Of course, some couples couldn't stand the stuff. They'd take polite sips, then leave the rest untouched beside the bed, hoping no one would notice. Others drank it all too quickly, then spent the first hours of their marriage fighting off hiccups or drowsiness. There's one tale of a groom who confused the wine with a strong vinegar used for pickling turnips. He drank, deeply grimaced in horror, and promptly lost all romantic momentum. His bride reportedly laughed so hard that the helpful matron had to intervene. Whether the story's true or just another scroll-side legend, it highlights a truth. When expectations are this high, a little chaos is inevitable. The wine also carried superstitions. It was believed that if the cup cracked during the toast, the marriage would face hardship. If a drop spilled on the bride's robe, it meant a fiery temper in the years ahead. And if the groom sneezed after his first sip, well, some said that was a sign of infidelity. Others claimed it just meant he had allergies. Either way, the pressure was on. Every movement, every sound, even every sip was loaded with meaning. You could drown in the symbolism before even finishing your drink. There were workarounds, though. Some families, particularly among the scholarly class, brewed a subtler version of the wine using chrysanthemum or osmanthus petals instead of potent roots. The effect was more calming than invigorating, and it made for a more poetic experience. One famous poet even claimed that drinking osmanthus wine with his bride made their first night feel like sleeping under a fragrant sky. Whether this was romance or mild intoxication is anyone's guess. And let's not forget the post-wedding wine. Yes, there was more. After the couple retreated behind the curtain, a small bowl of wine was left by the bed, often with a floating petal or two. This was the quiet wine meant to symbolize peaceful rest and gentle beginnings. It was rarely touched, but its presence mattered. In some households it was secretly sipped by the helpful matron who believed it kept her young. Others said it was for the ancestors who might drop in to offer their invisible blessing, or just to eavesdrop. By the time the wine bowls were empty or ignored, the couple was usually tipsy enough to forget their fears or sleepy enough to call it a night. Either way, the wine had done its job. It blurred the edges of the moment, softened the strangeness, and gave them something to talk about besides dragon carvings and fan etiquette. and if nothing else, it gave their story a beginning that tasted like goji berries, smelled like panic, and lingered like an herb shop at midnight. The first tear was often shed long before the wedding night began. In fact, in certain parts of ancient China, crying was not just accepted, it was expected, rehearsed, and sometimes even scheduled. This wasn't your modern mascara-smudged, emotionally overwhelmed kind of crying. No, this was theatrical weeping passed down like an heirloom with specific rules about when to start, how long to wail, and which metaphors to sob through. A bride might cry for days before the wedding, surrounded by sisters, cousins, and female elders, all chanting laments in harmony like a choir of well-trained heartbreak. It was called the crying marriage ritual, kujia, and to outsiders it might have looked like a family mourning a funeral rather than celebrating a union. The purpose behind all this sorrow was complex. On the surface, it symbolised a bride's reluctance to leave her parents, her home, and the life she knew. It gave weight to her transition, wrapped in layers of grief and duty. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find something else, a subtle protest. A final, socially sanctioned resistance. Because once she crossed that threshold, once the veil dropped, and the red candles flickered, she belonged to another family. And not just metaphorically. Her body, her labour, even her womb were now part of someone else's household economy. So yes, she cried. Wouldn't you? Each region had its own flavour of sorrow. In Sichuan, brides began weeping up to a month before the big day, starting alone in their room, before gradually being joined by their mother, their grandmother, and eventually the neighbourhood women. It became a layered chorus, each voice entering like an instrument in a sad symphony. The bride might sing lines like, "My green willow, my red chamber, I leave you for distant winds," while her mother replied, "You are the branch that blooms on someone else's tree." Honestly, Shakespeare could never. Historians still argue whether these rituals were empowering acts of feminine solidarity or just another way to dramatise the inevitable. Interestingly, the crying didn't always stop once the bride entered her new home. There are records of brides quietly sobbing behind the red curtain, just moments before the groom lifted her veil. Some did it because they were terrified of unfamiliar expectations, of judgment, of the weight of unfamiliar eyes. Others cried because they missed home, or because the ginseng wine was stronger than advertised, and some quite plainly cried because they didn't want to be there. It wasn't always love. Sometimes it was obligation strategy or survival. The chamber became the softest cage money could furnish. But not all tears were tragic. In fact, crying could be strategic. A well-timed sob might earn a bride a gentler mother-in-law. It could soften the groom's tone or endear her to household servants. It showed emotion, which in a society ruled by structure and restraint was its own kind of statement. Brides who didn't cry were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Does she not care? Is she too eager to leave her family? Is she heartless? So even if a bride felt fine, she might squeeze out a few obligatory tears. Better safe than socially exiled. There were also props. Some brides carried handkerchiefs embroidered with lotus flowers or stitched with family proverbs, small cloths meant to catch tears and send a message. A popular motif was the duck that cries, but swims on a poetic way of saying, "Feel everything, then keep going." In one story from the late Ming era, a bride brought 3 handkerchiefs with her, one for the carriage ride, one for the bedroom, and one to bury in the garden of her new home. She whispered her secrets into the last one and planted it under a plum tree. Whether the plum ever bore fruit is anyone's guess, but the gesture was recorded in family memory like scripture. Men were not expected to cry. If they did, it was usually behind closed doors, and even then rarely spoken of. A crying groom was seen as weak, unstable, or overly romantic, all problematic labels in a world that prized masculine stoicism. That said, one whispered tale from the Qing dynasty describes a scholar groom who cried when he saw his bride's embroidered slippers placed neatly by the bed. They looked so small, he reportedly said, and she looked so far from home. The matron gave him a biscuit and told him to focus. It remains one of the few romantic exceptions preserved in an otherwise emotionally repressed archive. Sometimes the helpful matron facilitated the tears. She'd say something provocative, "Your mother will miss your laughter," or "Tonight your father sleeps alone in a quieter house," just enough to unlock the dam. Then she'd nod approvingly and offer a cup of warm tea as if to say, "Well done. Crying quota achieved." In her eyes, a crying bride was a sign of respect. A dry-eyed bride that required monitoring, possibly fumigation. Of course, the wedding chamber wasn't immune to laughter either. Some brides burst into nervous giggles mid-sob, resulting in a kind of emotional whiplash that confused everyone. Is she mourning or amused, the groom might wonder. Both replied the chamber walls. It was a night thick with contradiction, joy woven with dread, beauty stitched into goodbye, and laughter trapped inside tears. The veil may have been lifted, but the emotional fog never cleared all at once. In some rare traditions, brides were actually encouraged to cry after the wedding night as well. The morning after, as she bowed before the ancestors and served tea to her in-laws, a few gentle tears were seen as a sign of modesty and virtue. "She's not boastful," they'd say. "She's humble like a willow." And thus the cycle continued, cry before cry during cry after. But in the midst of all that sobbing, something astonishing happened. The bride became real, human, seen, and perhaps that was the truest purpose of the ritual, not just to mourn a past, but to announce a presence. So if you find yourself drifting into the wedding chamber of ancient China, don't be surprised by the tears. They're not always tragic. They're part of the script, yes, but also part of the truth. A truth too big for a single smile. A truth that needs a fan, a sip of wine, and sometimes a handkerchief soaked in salt water to carry it into the next chapter. Come morning, when the wedding candles had burned down to stubs and the ginseng wine had long faded from their lips, all eyes turned not to the couple, not even to the matron, but to the sheets. Yes, the bed sheets. In certain parts of ancient China, especially among conservative rural families and traditional elite households, the state of the bedding became a matter of family interest, reputation, and somehow cosmic balance. The phrase "sheets don't lie" wasn't a proverb, but it might as well have been. Because those crimson or white linens gently folded by some dutiful servant or inquisitive aunt were believed to reveal the truth about the bride's virtue and the couple's success. At the heart of it was the infamous red spot test, a custom built on the assumption that a virgin bride would upon consummation leave a trace of blood on the sheets. To us that might sound clinical, even invasive. But in a world where marriages were often arranged and honour was publicly traded, this small mark of biology carried monumental weight. A blood-stained cloth wasn't just laundry, it was proof of purity, a receipt of the family's investment, and a badge of righteousness for both households involved. If it was there, families breathed easier. If it wasn't, well, suddenly everyone wanted to talk about fabric dye. Of course, biology doesn't always cooperate with superstition. Not every bride bled, and not every groom knew what to look for. Some in their anxiety might have checked the wrong side of the blanket. Others mistook spilled wine for the sign and celebrated early. One record from the late Ming dynasty tells of a groom who proudly waved a handkerchief over breakfast, only for the matron to point out that it was actually a makeup smudge from the bride's cheek. His mother fainted from embarrassment. Historians still argue whether the practice was ever truly reliable, or just an elaborate cultural placebo with a laundry problem. Then there were the workarounds. In households with progressive leanings or pragmatic mothers, the bride might carry a tiny sachet of crushed pomegranate seeds, or beet-dyed cloth in her sleeve just in case. With a discreet motion and a well-timed distraction, a little red could be introduced onto the sheets without anyone the wiser. Some say this was deception. Others say it was survival. After all, when your entire future in a new household could hinge on a droplet of symbolism, who wouldn't carry insurance? The task of inspecting the sheets usually fell to the matron or an elder female relative, someone trusted, sharp-eyed, and well-versed in the nuances of textile storytelling. She would rise early before the couple emerged and step lightly into the chamber. With the care of someone opening sacred scripture, she would pull back the covers, lift the sheet, and examine it in the soft glow of morning light. Sometimes she smiled, sometimes she frowned, sometimes she said nothing and just carried the sheet away like a state secret. But make no mistake, word would spread. In many households the results were quietly acknowledged, perhaps with an extra spoon of lotus porridge at breakfast, or a mother-in-law's approving glance. In others the sheet was publicly displayed, hung like a tiny red flag of honour. Yes, literally hung. On a laundry line or bamboo pole near the courtyard, fluttering proudly in the breeze. Neighbours would see it, servants would whisper about it, and the bride, often still aching and half asleep, would sip her tea knowing that her most intimate moment had become a banner of social validation. Romantic. Not exactly, but highly efficient. Now what if the sheet revealed nothing? No mark, no smudge, just clean silk and a rising sense of panic. In those cases the atmosphere shifted. Explanations were sought. Was the bride nervous? Was the groom gentle? Was it a full moon? Maybe they were tired. Maybe they didn't even try. In some regions, the couple would be quietly questioned, sometimes separately, sometimes by a concerned matron holding a cup of very strong tea. If no satisfying answer came, consequences varied. A discreet priest might be consulted. A second night might be arranged. Or in more extreme cases, gossip began to slither through the house like incense smoke gone sour. And yet it wasn't always doom and scandal. There were stories, plenty of them, of families choosing grace over scrutiny. A mother-in-law who pretended not to notice. A groom who offered his hand over his bride's and said, "We're happy. Isn't that enough?" These quiet rebellions didn't make it into the formal scrolls, but they survived in whispers passed down by women who knew that love couldn't always be measured in stains. Sometimes a clean sheet was just a clean sheet. Still the symbolism refused to fade. Even in households that rejected the literal inspection, the bed remained a site of quiet judgment. If the couple emerged cheerful and composed, it was assumed the night had gone well. If the bride looked anxious, or the groom was unusually quiet, the silence spoke volumes. Breakfast became a theatre of glances and subtext. The bride might be offered a second cup of tea symbolising approval, or not symbolising, well, the opposite. Over time some tried to reinvent the tradition. Wealthier brides introduced custom-embroidered sheets with symbolic flowers, plum blossoms for resilience, orchids for elegance as a way to redirect the focus. Instead of asking, "Did she bleed?" guests were nudged to ask, "Isn't that embroidery exquisite?" In one bold case during the Qing dynasty, a bride commissioned an entire poem stitched into her bedding. It read, "Let no linen define my virtue, nor silence define my voice." The marriage lasted 38 years. The sheet is now in a museum. Ultimately, the practice of sheet inspection began to fade slowly, unevenly, and never fully. It lingered longer in the countryside, where traditions clung like vines to old walls. In cities it became a relic, a whisper, a story told by grandmothers who rolled their eyes even as they recounted it. But even where it vanished in form, its shadow remained. The idea that a woman's worth could be proven or disproven in a single night on a single piece of cloth haunted generations long after the stains disappeared. So now picture the morning light slipping through the silk curtains, catching the folds of the bed where two people lay unsure of what had just happened. The room smells faintly of wine, sandalwood and damp fabric. Footsteps approach. Someone draws back the curtain. And for a few breathless seconds it's not love or intimacy or kindness that matters, but a single silent sheet. For all the focus on the bride, her tears, her veil, her virtue wrapped in layers of silk, the groom had his own quiet storm to weather. While he may have looked calm under his elaborate hat and stiff robe, 1,000 thoughts probably gnawed at him beneath the surface. Because in ancient China, being a groom wasn't just about smiling for relatives and holding the wine cup correctly. It was a high-stakes test in dignity, stamina, lineage, and performance, emotional, ceremonial, and yes, physical. The wedding night wasn't just a celebration. For the groom, it was an examination he wasn't allowed to fail. From a young age, boys were taught to revere the concept of filial piety and uphold the family name. That sounded noble enough until you realised it meant producing a son as quickly as possible, preferably a healthy one, preferably within the first year. No pressure, right? The groom walked into the wedding chamber not only with desire and nerves, but with the weight of his ancestors pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible council of disapproving uncles. If he hesitated, fumbled, or heaven forbid, failed entirely, it wasn't just awkward, it was shameful. Now, nobody said this out loud, of course. Ancient Chinese culture prized restraint and dignity, especially for men. So while the bride might be allowed to cry behind her veil, the groom was expected to be composed, knowledgeable, and in theory already wise in the ways of the world. But here's the twist: many grooms were completely inexperienced, especially in arranged marriages among the scholar class, where boys were kept focused on exams, inkstones, and Confucian texts, until the day they were suddenly expected to be lovers and household heads. Reading the Book of Rites doesn't quite prepare you for trembling hands and candlelit pressure. There were manuals, yes, those same scrolls that taught a groom to approach the bed as a general approaches a battlefield, but they were abstract at best and misleading at worst. They offered metaphors instead of methods. Move like wind over water, touch like ink upon silk. Lovely poetry, but not particularly useful if your bride was crying softly into a handkerchief and the matron was humming behind the curtain. Historians still debate whether these scrolls helped or simply increased the sense of impending doom. And then there was the matter of timing. Not just being timely, but lasting long enough to prove your strength. Lasting too briefly brought ridicule. Lasting too long raised eyebrows. There were no stopwatches, of course, but plenty of speculation. Grooms were quietly encouraged to drink herbal tonics, ginseng cordyceps, deer antler powder, sometimes so bitter they could peel the enamel off your teeth. One mix, known as the dragon's tincture, was said to cause heart palpitations and unpredictable sneezing. But if it worked, no one asked questions. In elite families, the groom might have tutors or uncles who offered cryptic advice before the wedding, usually over a heavy meal and far too much wine. Be confident, one might say, like the emperor entering his palace. Another would add, don't ask her too many questions. It's not an exam. The groom would nod, pretend to understand, and wish someone had just handed him a map, or a parachute. Compounding the stress was the presence of spectators, if not in the room, then in the hallway, the courtyard, or hovering just beyond the curtain like nosy ghosts. The groom was aware of them. Everyone was. They waited for signs, laughter, movement, a shout, or silence. That particular brand of silence, the too still quiet that made mothers-in-law exchange worried glances, was every groom's nightmare. In some homes, he might even be expected to emerge briefly after the first act to sip tea with male relatives and display the confidence of a man who had fulfilled his duty. Imagine being required to glow on demand. And of course, not every groom liked what he found under the veil. Some were surprised, some disappointed, others overwhelmed by the strangeness of being so physically near someone they'd never truly met. A few fell in love instantly, if we believe the stories. But many simply panicked internally, keeping a stone face while their stomachs tied themselves into increasingly complicated knots. The idea of honour left no room for cold feet. A groom could not excuse himself. There were no rain checks on destiny. Perhaps the most private anxiety came from comparison, real or imagined. Grooms worried whether they would be remembered fondly, whether the bride would speak kindly of them the next day. Would she write to her mother and say he was gentle and confident, or would she say nothing at all worse perhaps than any criticism? In families where concubines were common, even a first wife could be quietly replaced in affection. A groom's wedding night wasn't just a personal moment, it was a performance, with implications for status inheritance, and future domestic harmony. In some regions, if the groom was particularly young or nervous, a more experienced female relative might be sent to speak with the bride beforehand. "Be patient," she'd say. "He's a good man, just unsure." Occasionally even the bride herself had been given quiet instructions to take the lead if necessary, though always with great subtlety. Because even if the groom had no idea what he was doing, the illusion that he did was to be carefully protected. Masculine dignity, after all, was as fragile as the porcelain cups they toasted with. Still not all grooms crumbled. Some found unexpected calm in the quiet moments, the clink of cups, the soft scent of sandalwood, the shared awkwardness. They reached for the bride's hand with trembling fingers, and found hers trembling too. They whispered something foolish, and she smiled. And just like that, the curtain lifted, not just the literal one, but the invisible barrier between two strangers, forced into a lifetime together. There, in the hushed red glow of the chamber, anxiety became humanity. And maybe, just maybe, a beginning. So yes, the bride cried. The matron listened. The sheets awaited judgment. But tucked inside all that embroidered ceremony was a young man with sweaty palms rehearsed poetry, and a family legacy balanced on the edge of a bed. And somewhere just outside the curtains, someone was waiting to ask, how did it go? Not knowing that sometimes the hardest part was simply walking in the door. There were wedding nights in ancient China that passed quietly, awkward glances exchanged under flickering candlelight, a few clumsy words, and then eventually sleep. But not everywhere. In some regions, especially among rural or theatrical communities, the wedding chamber wasn't just a private retreat, it was a performance space. Yes, a literal stage. The door barely shut behind the bride and groom before it creaked open again to admit a crowd of guests, relatives, and giggling teenagers, all eager to celebrate the first steps of conjugal life in a way that blurred the line between tradition and spectacle. The chamber, swathed in red and perfumed with sandalwood, suddenly became the world's most awkward theatre. This wasn't about voyeurism, well, not openly. These dramatised wedding nights were ritualised events meant to encourage harmony and bless the couple through carefully orchestrated, mostly symbolic activities. But the line between encouragement and embarrassment was razor thin. The couple, fully clothed and seated rigidly on the edge of the marriage bed, were expected to take part in scripted games riddles and drinking challenges as their guests crowded around, laughing and clapping. Some regions even had a term for it, now dongfang, stirring up the bridal room. Think of it as a highly publicised pressure cooker complete with commentary and a one-act play starring two terrified leads. At first the events were innocent enough. A mischievous cousin might hide the groom's embroidered shoes, forcing him to crawl beneath the bed and search. Or a friend might offer a bowl of Tang Yuan sweet sticky rice balls and dare the couple to eat from the same spoon. Sometimes the bride was asked to recite a poem while balancing a cup of wine on her head. If the wine spilled, the groom had to drink it off the floor. It was slapstick ceremonial and mildly humiliating, like a Confucian episode of Candid Camera. But things could escalate. In more boisterous circles, guests demanded performances, a love song, a reenactment of the proposal, or even a dramatic reading of the marriage contract. One notorious tradition involved coaxing the groom to remove the bride's shoes with his teeth, cheered on by his future in-laws no less. Another required the bride to guess which of several fruit-filled boxes contained the symbolic fertility peach. Pick the wrong one, and someone shouted, "Try again in 9 months." It was all in good fun, at least that's what everyone said, while the bride's ears turned scarlet and the groom attempted to laugh without crying. Theatrics weren't confined to actions. Words played a central role. Guests hurled riddles and double entendres like festive grenades, daring the couple to respond without blushing too hard. What's soft wraps around the body and must be handled gently on the first night, a groomsman might ask with a grin. The correct answer was a quilt. The incorrect answers were plentiful. These games served as a cultural pressure valve, breaking the tension with humour and letting everyone pretend the elephant in the room was just another decorative paper lantern. Historians still argue about the purpose of Now Dongfang. Some believe it functioned as a fertility blessing, rousing the couple's passion through laughter and community involvement. Others view it as social surveillance disguised as festivity, a way for the village to ensure the marriage had begun properly, and the couple was psychologically compatible. After all, if you couldn't survive a night of jokes and nudges, how would you manage decades of shared rice and in-law diplomacy? Either way, the message was clear. Marriage wasn't a private contract. It was a community affair. Of course not every couple enjoyed the experience. Some brides wept silently behind fans. Some grooms drank more wine than recommended and simply endured. One folk story tells of a groom who fainted during the performance and had to be revived with vinegar-soaked cloth. Another tells of a bride who outwitted every riddle and then flipped the script by issuing her own, asking her audience to define intimacy without interference. No one had an answer. She reportedly went on to become a renowned poet. There were limits, though. If the bride's family held significant status or simply drew the line, the festivities ended at the door. Some households hung talismans of tigers or painted the threshold with vinegar to repel chaos. In one coastal village, the bride's family lined the walkway with slippery eel skins to discourage guests from lingering too long. As you can imagine, it was effective and slightly horrifying, but it got the point across this chamber was for intimacy, not improv comedy. Interestingly, the behaviour of the guests was often judged just as much as the couples. Too rowdy and they were seen as disrespectful. Too quiet and they were called boring. There was a Goldilocks zone of enthusiasm, enough to generate laughter, not enough to trigger trauma. The best wedding chambers struck that balance. A few jokes, a couple of awkward games, maybe a chicken-shaped lantern passed around, while someone played the flute badly. Then, eventually, a polite excuse let them rest. The door closed, the audience departed, and the real wedding night could at last begin, and yet for many the performance was the most memorable part. Years later they might not recall exactly what was whispered behind the canopy, or whether the candles burned out before midnight. But they'd remember the moment the groom tried to recite a love poem with a mouthful of candied lotus root, or when the bride, stone-faced, outstared her mother-in-law during a silent game of who blinks first. These memories, absurd as they were, became the foundation for laughter in harder years. A shared joke, a mutual cringe, a beginning not of perfection but of participation. So when the chamber became a stage, it wasn't about humiliation, it was about initiation. Into a family, a village, a world where no one got to be completely alone. Where even the most intimate space had an audience and love had to bloom with a laugh track. It was absurd. It was exhausting. And it was ancient China at its most theatrical, a night wrapped in red silk rice wine and the echo of poorly timed punchlines. For many modern minds, a wedding night is just that one night, a flicker of celebration followed by normal life creeping back in with the morning light. But in many corners of ancient China, the marital chamber was never just about a single evening. It stretched into days and sometimes into weeks, unfolding like an extended ceremony that refused to fade quietly. The red curtains didn't come down after one performance. They stayed drawn for a whole season of episodes. And for the newlyweds, the first month of marriage often felt less like a honeymoon, and more like an extended job interview, with unpredictable reviews. This period was sometimes known informally as the Yufang, the moon chamber phase, marking the first full lunar cycle after marriage. It was a time both symbolic and socially charged. The couple remained partially cloistered, navigating not only each other's awkward habits and silences, but also a steady stream of rituals, symbolic visits, and low-stakes tests handed out like polite dares by the household, from elders checking on their spirit harmony to aunties casually placing lotus seeds near the bedding. Every morning the message was clear: this was no casual union. This was continuity in motion. In the first 3 days alone, the couple had at least half a dozen scripted rituals to perform. One involved lighting incense each morning at a small altar in the corner of the chamber, offering thanks to ancestors for granting harmony through the night. even if the night had been nothing but two nervous people sleeping back to back. Another required the couple to drink a second round of union wine on the third night, often in front of the groom's parents, which really takes the intimacy out of the moment. It wasn't uncommon for the bride to bow to her in-laws again during this phase just to reaffirm her humility. The newlywed's knees must have ached more than her heart. Then came the checking. Not the sheets this time, though in some places those were examined daily, but subtler signs. Was the bride's hair glossy and well combed each morning? Did the groom emerge from the chamber looking proud or puzzled? Did they smile when spoken to, or did their expressions seem a bit too neutral? Elders became body language analysts. The helpful matron, if still present, acted like a palace attendant, monitoring the moods of an emperor and empress. One frown could trigger a family meeting. Meals were also part of the extended observation. Breakfast was sent to the chamber each morning, served on lacquered trays with symbolic foods, red eggs, sticky rice balls, longan soup. Every bite had meaning. Were the eggs eaten, fertility assured? Did the rice balls remain untouched? Possible marital friction. One bride from a Guangdong village was once scolded for disrespect, because she only ate the pickled vegetables and ignored the lotus seeds. She favours sourness, perhaps her marriage will be bitter, an elder reportedly muttered as though taste buds predicted destiny. By the seventh day, the couple was often required to present themselves at a formal family gathering, sometimes called returning to court. This was not a courtroom, but it felt just as judgmental. They'd walk hand in hand, or at least side by side, into the main hall, bow to their elders, and accept small gifts or advice. Some couples were asked to recite poems together, or worse, reenact their first meeting for the benefit of great-uncles who claimed to have missed it. In some households, the mother-in-law would take this opportunity to test the bride's domestic knowledge. How many eggs go into sweet rice cake, which herb balances heat in winter stew? It was less about answers and more about composure. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, fertility symbols crept closer and closer to the bed. Pomegranates in vases, carved peachwood ornaments hanging above the pillow, scented satchels tied discreetly to the bedpost filled with mugwort and cinnamon bark to warm the womb, as one midwife poetically put it. One curious tradition involved placing a live cricket in a small cage beneath the bed. Its chirping was said to indicate rising passion, or at the very least that no one had accidentally crushed it overnight. And yes, there were physical evaluations too, subtle but present. If a bride gained a bit of fullness in her cheeks by the end of the month, whispers began about pregnancy. If not, elders simply nodded sagely and said, "The stars will align in time." In some noble households, the bride's garments were discreetly inspected for signs of conception. The body was watched as a temple, but also as an investment. That's the paradox of ancient Chinese marriage. You were sacred, but you were also an heirloom vessel. Painted, adored, and expected to produce results. Interestingly, this extended chamber phase wasn't entirely burdensome for all couples. For some, it offered a buffer time to understand each other without immediately plunging into the chaos of domestic duties. The bride was often exempt from household chores, for this month considered too spiritually delicate to chop garlic or sweep courtyards. The groom was given light duties or none at all unless he was a scholar preparing for exams. It was a rare pause in a life that would soon be filled with rice-counting, pig-feeding and tea-serving. Of course there were exceptions. If the couple belonged to a merchant family or artisan class, duty often crept in early. A groom might be summoned to the counting house by day 4, and a bride might be helping pickle radishes by day 6. But even so, the symbolic structure of the moon chamber lingered. The couple still returned to the marriage bed each night with the unspoken weight of observation all around them. If nothing else, they learned quickly that marriage wasn't just about two people. It was about performance repetition and managing expectations with clean robes. When the 30th day approached, there was often a quiet closing ritual. The couple would light incense one last time, bow to the family altar together, and receive a new set of bedding fresh red silk, embroidered with lotus blossoms or dragonflies. This signalled the end of the ceremonial phase and the beginning of ordinary married life. The curtain was no longer sacred. The bed was now simply a bed, and the two people who had once trembled under the gaze of every relative in a 10-mile radius were finally allowed to just exist. But even after the red lanterns dimmed and the guests stopped peeking in, traces of the moon chamber remained. The habits formed, the glances rehearsed, the odd rituals involving crickets and soup, these didn't vanish overnight. They became the foundation, the rhythms of a marriage not born in privacy but in community repetition and the daily performance of harmony. Some chambers reigned silent, not because the couple was shy, but because only one of them was breathing. Welcome to the eerie corner of ancient Chinese tradition, where the veil was lifted, the incense lit, and the bride didn't blink because she was no longer among the living. The ghost bride, or Minghun, wasn't a myth whispered to scare children. It was a practiced, solemn ritual complete with dowries, ancestral blessings, and yes, a wedding night of sorts. The idea to marry the dead to the dead or stranger, still the dead to the living, so that no soul would wander alone for eternity. The roots of ghost marriage reached deep into the Han dynasty, and possibly even earlier, tied closely to ancestor worship and the belief that souls without partners would become restless spirits. A son who died unmarried was seen as incomplete, not just in life, but in death. His spirit might disturb the household, appear in dreams, or withhold blessings from future generations. The solution: find him a bride, preferably one who had also passed. But if no suitable ghost girl was available, a living woman would sometimes be chosen to marry the dead. Yes, you read that correctly. A living bride, fully veiled in red, might be wed to a paper effigy of a groom, or even to an ancestral tablet carved in his name. The ceremony followed many of the same steps as a regular wedding. A red palanquin, musicians playing mournful wedding tunes, a feast that was half joyful, half funereal. The bride would kneel before the spirit tablet, pour wine as an offering, and bow 3 times, once to heaven and earth, once to the ancestors, and once to her spectral spouse. Then she would be led to the bridal chamber, alone. That chamber looked much like any other red curtains, carved bed incense curling into the air like a silent guest. But the bed remained untouched. In place of a groom, there might be a silk bundle dressed in men's robes, or a paper figure propped delicately against the pillows. The living bride would sit beside it fully dressed and wait. Wait until the candles burned low. Wait until the matron, watching from the shadows, declared the ritual complete, and then she'd lie down beside a presence that didn't breathe. For those marrying ghost to ghost, the process was slightly less surreal, yet still drenched in emotion. Families of the deceased exchanged betrothal gifts just as the living would: food, silks, sometimes livestock. Paper effigies were burned, houses, clothes, furniture, even miniature bridal beds, so the couple could enjoy a proper married life in the afterworld. The ceremony itself often took place at night near ancestral tombs or shrines, with priests overseeing the ritual and chanting verses to guide the souls. One recorded story tells of a family who staged an entire banquet for a ghost couple, leaving 2 empty chairs and serving plates of food that remained untouched, yet later found mysteriously disturbed. The motivations for ghost marriages weren't always spiritual. Sometimes they were deeply practical. In a patriarchal society where lineage mattered more than almost anything, an unmarried son's name couldn't be properly recorded in ancestral registers without a spouse. No spouse meant no heirs, even spiritual ones. By marrying him posthumously, the family could adopt a relative's child under his name, preserving the family line and calming superstitious fears. The ghost marriage, then, was both a rite and a legal maneuver. But what of the living ghost brides? Their lives after the ceremony varied. Some returned to their birth families, now marked symbolically as widows, yes, widows without ever having known their husbands. Others moved into the deceased groom's household, taking on ceremonial roles as daughter-in-law caretakers of shrines and symbols of unwavering filial duty. These women often wore subdued colours, avoided remarriage, and were praised for their sacrifice. One such woman recorded in Qing dynasty archives was honoured by her village for choosing eternal loyalty to a man she never met. Others, less enthusiastic, quietly slipped away to start new lives under different names. Not all ghost marriages were arranged with consent. Desperation and fear sometimes led families to make shady choices. There were tales, murky, uncomfortable, of grave robbers stealing bones of young women to be used in posthumous unions. One legend speaks of a family that offered a bride price to a poor peasant couple only for their daughter to die mysteriously days later, conveniently available for ghost marriage. Historians still debate how widespread such practices were, but the darker side of Minghun has long fed the folklore of haunted brides and cursed chambers. And yes, there were hauntings, or at least stories of them. Chambers that remained cold no matter how many braziers were lit. Bridal beds that creaked under invisible weight. Brides who awoke with silk sashes tied in new knots, or wedding shoes moved slightly from where they'd been placed. Was it wind, the matron cleaning in secret, or something more curious? Whatever the cause, households whispered and burned more incense, hoping the union, though unnatural, would hold. Still, for many, the ghost marriage was not a horror story. It was an act of compassion, a way to honour the dead, to fulfil obligations that had been interrupted by fate. Love wasn't always involved, but then again it often wasn't in living marriages either. At its heart, Minghun reflected the ancient belief that connection, marriage, family ritual didn't end at death. It simply changed format. So if you ever find yourself in a dim wedding chamber and the air feels just a touch too still, don't panic. Perhaps the chamber was once used for a marriage where only one partner ever breathed. Perhaps the candle burned low for two names carved into tablets instead of faces beneath veils. And perhaps somewhere beyond the incense and silk, two spirits are still holding hands, bound not by flesh, but by red thread that stretches quietly between worlds. The red canopy was meant to shelter harmony, but in many wedding chambers it simply housed tension, especially when it wasn't the bride's first time seeing that bed, or when someone else had already claimed a side of it. In ancient China, marriage wasn't always a duet. It could be a trio, a quartet, or an entire silent chorus of women sharing one husband under the same roof but not the same fate. Enter the second wife, and her shadow the first. Though polygamy was not universally practiced, it was legally accepted, especially among the wealthy and scholarly classes. The primary wife, the Zhengji, held the highest status with her name written in the ancestral records, and her sons inheriting the most. But additional wives, known politely as kashitashi or sidewives, could be added later, especially if the first bore no children, or if the husband was simply expanding his domestic portfolio. And that's where things got complicated. Because when a second wife entered the picture, she didn't just enter a marriage, she entered someone else's territory. The wedding night for a second wife could be a theatre of invisible rivalries. Imagine being dressed in bright red lips, rouged veil, fluttering only to step into a chamber that already bore someone else's name in its carvings. The bed might be the same one the first wife used. The helpful matron might be the same too. Even the bedding, re-embroidered with fresh symbols, couldn't hide the sense that everything had been done once before, and someone else still occupied the space in memory, if not in body. The atmosphere was thick with unsaid things. Tradition dictated that the first wife had to approve the taking of a second. Approve, of course, being more formality than consent. Her blessing was usually announced with a polite smile, and a poem while behind the curtain, resentment brewed like old tea left too long in the pot. Sometimes the first wife remained distant. Sometimes she stayed physically close. In some chilling tales, she watched the second wife's wedding from the shadows, perhaps from the outer room, perhaps from the upstairs corridor, or perhaps from a heart that refused to yield. There were instances when the first wife was expected to participate in preparing the chamber. She might tie the curtain knots, light the wedding candles, place the fertility symbols. All the while she did so with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, because she knew she was preparing a space where she would be forgotten, at least for the night. Her silence spoke volumes. In one folk story, a first wife embroidered the second wife's pillow with a single hidden thread that read, "Enjoy what is mine." No one noticed for years. The second wife, for her part, was often younger, less educated, and sometimes from a poorer family. Her role was precarious welcomed as long as she remained graceful, obedient, and fertile. She might share the bed, but not the power. And on her wedding night, even as the candles burned and the wine was shared, she could feel the chill of disapproval pressing against her back like an unspoken draft. Every sigh was recorded, every pause interpreted. The room, though warm in colour, held cold politics in its corners. There were 2 shadow brides, a poetic and slightly haunting term for women married into a household in spirit rather than ceremony. This included concubines promoted after the death of a first wife, or women married posthumously to a man who had never met them in life. These women might never get a full ceremony. Their names might be written in smaller characters on family tablets, but their presence in the marriage chamber was felt sometimes by whispered prayers, sometimes by their portraits hanging near the bed, sometimes by the way servants hesitated before calling someone madam. One ghost story tells of a second wife who could not sleep in her wedding bed because every time she closed her eyes she dreamt of a woman sitting calmly at the foot of the bed combing her hair. The woman never spoke, just combed, every strand methodically. The matron said nothing, but replaced the bed linens with a new set embroidered with lotus blossoms, symbols of peace and renewal. The dream stopped, but the second wife never quite smiled the same again. Living arrangements complicated things further. While the primary wife usually had her own suite, the second wife might live in a side room, or if the husband favoured her, share his sleeping quarters. This made evenings uncomfortable at best. The presence of 2 wives, and sometimes more, turned the chamber into a place not just of intimacy, but of invisible negotiation. Who got which pillow? Who lit the incense? Who rose first in the morning and offered tea to the husband? Even silence had a pecking order. Some women used this ambiguity to their advantage. Clever second wives mastered the art of subtlety, laughing softly at the right moment, feigning shyness just long enough to be charming but not manipulative. Others found solace in sisterhood, forming close bonds with the first wives over shared complaints and survival tactics. But many simply endured. The red veil may have lifted, but the hierarchy remained. Children, of course, changed everything. A second wife who bore sons could rise in status even over a childless primary wife, and this tilted the chamber's balance. Where once there had been symbolism and careful deference, there might now be rivalry, cold glances over breakfast, or passive-aggressive notes left in the incense drawer. The marriage bed, once embroidered with dragons and phoenixes, became a silent battlefield of succession. Still, there were stories of peace. Some households, through sheer luck or personality alchemy, managed to create something like harmony. Wives divided duties, shared space, raised children together. The marriage chamber became less of a battleground and more of a strangely cooperative office space. But those were rare. More often, the red silk canopy above the bed witnessed years of shifting alliances and carefully measured words. So when a second wife stepped into the wedding chamber, she didn't just step into a marriage, she stepped into a novel already half written. Her every move would be footnoted by the presence of the woman who came before her, or the ones who stood beside her. And while the dragon and phoenix still danced on the bedpost, they no longer represented a couple. They stood for a constellation, many wings, many flames, all tangled beneath the same embroidered roof. Beyond the silken veils and phoenix-embroidered quilts of the average wedding chamber stood another world entirely colder, more calculated and thick with secrets. Welcome to the imperial palace, where marriage was never just about romance or even children. It was politics with a perfume bottle. Here the wedding night wasn't a private moment, but a carefully staged ritual observed and recorded like a state affair. And those doing the observing, not family, not matrons. but palace eunuchs quiet, meticulous and everywhere. In the Forbidden City and similar royal courts across dynastic China, the emperor's wedding night was less about passion and more about protocol. From the first sip of wine to the last candle flicker, every detail was managed, noted, and evaluated. The emperor didn't simply stroll into the bridal chamber unannounced. He was escorted formally by senior eunuchs and high-ranking court officials, all dressed to the teeth and holding scrolls of ceremonial text. A literal procession to consummation. Subtlety was not on the menu. The bride, usually a young woman from a powerful noble family, had undergone months, sometimes years, of grooming for this night. She knew the chamber layout, the sequence of bows, the order of greetings. What she didn't always know was what the emperor looked like, or whether he would even stay the whole night. He had options, many options. A palace full of consorts and concubines meant that this particular evening, though steeped in tradition, was more about ticking a box than forging a bond. Still, the symbolism had to be flawless. The chamber was draped in red and gold, the dragon and phoenix motifs embroidered with real gold thread. The bed stood on a slightly raised platform, just high enough to remind everyone involved that this wasn't ordinary furniture. Candles were arranged in specific directions meant to align with auspicious stars. The sheets were ironed flat as scrolls. And tucked under the pillow, placed with quiet ceremony by a eunuch, was a folded piece of silk embroidered with a single word, harmony. The eunuchs, those ever-present figures of imperial life, were the silent operators of the whole affair. Castrated young and trained in palace etiquette, they were the only men allowed to move freely among the emperor's women. Their role on the wedding night was not passive. They prepared the chamber, they guided the bride, they escorted the emperor to the door, and most oddly of all, stood just outside listening. Not intrusively, mind you. Just attentively. Because what happened or didn't happen would be recorded. Yes, there were records. Short cryptic and written on bamboo slips or silk scrolls, they contained not romantic musings but clinical notes. Entered chamber at the hour of the rat. Tea left untouched. Curtain drawn precisely. Bed left by second watch. These notes were sent to the Empress Dowager or court historians not for gossip, but for dynastic record-keeping. Because if a child was born 9 months later, someone needed to verify the timeline. And in case of succession disputes, every red curtain and candle became retroactive evidence. Palace intrigue only deepened the complexity. Many imperial marriages were arranged to solidify political alliances. The bride might be from a rival faction or a family too powerful to ignore. If she gained favour on the wedding night, her entire clan rose in influence. If not, she might find herself quietly reassigned to a lesser residence before the next full moon. One whispered legend tells of a bride who charmed the emperor not with beauty, but by pretending to spill wine on purpose so he would linger long enough to speak. Her cleverness earned her a son, and later, a suspicious fall down the stairs. Eunuchs were not above playing politics themselves. Loyal to factions, empresses, or their own agendas, they could influence what was written in those precious chamber notes. A favourable report might buy the bride more visits. A vague or neutral one might doom her to the sidelines. Some eunuchs even carried notes between concubines and the emperor, acting as messengers of affection, seduction, or subtle manipulation. The wedding chamber, then, was less of a sanctuary and more of a stage where power performed in whispers and silk. The bride, though outwardly composed, walked a tightrope. She had to be modest, but not cold, graceful, but not too eager, intelligent, but not threatening. One wrong gesture, too much eye contact, a misplaced laugh, a poorly timed poem, and the emperor might lose interest. Worse, he might become suspicious. And suspicion in the palace was like spilled ink, impossible to contain. A sigh in the chamber could echo into exile. Despite all the tension, some imperial couples did find genuine connection. Against the odds, a shared joke, a quiet smile, or a moment of mutual curiosity could bloom into something softer. But even then, affection had to pass through layers of tradition, hierarchy, and surveillance. The red candles still burned. The eunuch still waited outside. The silk scrolls still needed filling. Even love had to be documented. In rare cases, the emperor skipped the chamber entirely. He sent a double, a symbolic visit. Or in one case, recorded during the late Qing dynasty, he fell asleep during the feast and forgot to appear at all. The eunuchs, panicked but pragmatic, still filled out the notes-entered chamber at Hour of the Ox. Bride meditated, harmony assured. No one asked questions. The illusion was preserved. The system preferred symbolism over scandal. And what of the brides who waited but were never touched? They lived in red-roofed rooms surrounded by palace walls, becoming shadows among silk screens. Some turned bitter, some became poets, some plotted. But all remembered that first night not as a romantic milestone, but as a political audition. And the bed carved with dragons and phoenixes remembered too. Not just who lay on it, but who didn't. So in the end, the imperial wedding chamber was never just about consummation. It was an archive, a chessboard, a theatre lit with oil lamps and heavy with expectation. Every candle, every curtain, fold, every note scribbled in the margin of a eunuch's memory became part of the dynasty's lifeblood. And though love might flicker for a moment, it always had to make room for power. Not every wedding night ended in fluttering veils, shared wine, and furtive glances beneath embroidered covers. In some chambers the candles burned untouched, the bedding remained smooth, and two young people lay side by side with miles of silence between them. A wedding night without touch, though rarely spoken of, was more common in ancient China than romantic tales would have you believe. Sometimes it was planned, sometimes it was unintentional. But in every case, the absence of touch whispered more about the world around the couple than the couple themselves. Take child marriages, for instance, tradition not rooted in affection, but in strategy. Families betroth children as young as 8 or 10 to solidify alliances, consolidate property, or ensure that promising sons and daughters were safely tied to advantageous households before rivals could act. These weddings were celebrated with all the ceremony. Red palanquins, firecrackers, lanterns swaying like soft bells, but the bedchamber felt more like a nursery than a stage. The bride might still clutch a doll. The groom might be too short to light the candle. In these cases, the wedding night was symbolic, observed, but entirely postponed. A matron stood by, a scroll was signed, and the couple was tucked in separately like siblings. Of course, not all abstentions were due to age. Political marriages often resulted in frozen chambers. If a union was brokered between rival families, the wedding served as a truce, not a romance. The bride and groom, strangers in name and ideology, might greet each other with perfunctory bows, share the ceremonial wine, then sit rigidly on the edge of the bed like diplomatic statues. No jokes, no small talk. Just two pawns playing their part. One story from the Song dynasty describes a noble bride who slept with her back to her husband for 5 straight years. He in turn never asked her to turn around. Sometimes the reason was emotional. A bride might be terrified. Groom too. Perhaps they were both shy, or perhaps one of them had loved someone else, someone now far away, or buried beneath earth and memory. In such cases, the wedding night became a performance carried out for appearances. The red candles burned, the door closed, but inside they whispered apologies to past selves and waited for the dawn. Historians still argue whether a silent chamber was a failure or simply a different beginning. There were cultural layers too. In certain regions, it was customary for the couple to wait until the 2nd or 3rd night before becoming intimate. The first night was reserved for rituals, prayers, and symbolic gestures, like bowing together before ancestral tablets, or eating from the same pear. A pun in Chinese as sharing a pear sounds like separation, thus to avoid it was to bond. In these areas, restraint was a form of respect. One famous scholar wrote that true harmony waits like spring beneath snow unseen but certain. Or less poetically awkward now, better later. There were also marriages where intimacy was never meant to occur. This happened most often when the groom was severely ill, infirm, or emotionally withdrawn. In some tragic cases, the groom died before the wedding, and the bride still married his spirit, as in ghost marriages. But there were also real unions where the man lived but not fully. Perhaps he suffered from war injuries, or lived in a state of religious abstinence, and while the bride still followed the customs, veiling, bowing, entering the red chamber, she knew there would be no touch, only incense, silence, and sometimes grief. In rare but significant cases, the lack of intimacy was imposed by outside force. A powerful mother-in-law might instruct the groom to wait until certain omens aligned, or until ancestral approval was confirmed through divination. A marriage might be politically dangerous if the bride came from a recently disgraced family, for instance, so touching her too soon could taint the husband's fortunes. So he waited, sometimes out of obedience, sometimes out of genuine fear. There are records of grooms keeping to the far edge of the bed, eyes wide open, as if touch itself might summon a curse, and not all abstinence was unwilling. Some couples, through whispered conversation and shared glances, made a mutual decision to postpone, to speak first, to understand each other. These were rare, yes, but they did exist. A scholar's son and a merchant's daughter, married young, once agreed to exchange daily poems instead of nightly embraces. Within a year, their collection of verse grew longer than most marital contracts. The first time they touched hands was in the garden on their 100th day of marriage. The matron, eavesdropping from behind a peony bush, reportedly wept. Even the chamber's decor shifted with these dynamics. When intimacy wasn't expected, the bed might be adorned with plainer silk, fewer pomegranate motifs, and less emphasis on fertility symbols. The double happiness character was still present, of course it always was, but it might be tucked into a corner, folded into the curtain hem, instead of splashed boldly across the headboard. The candles still glowed, but perhaps only one was lit. The chamber remained red, but the energy was different, more solemn, more patient. In time, some of these marriages blossomed. The second night led to conversation, the third to a shared meal, and slowly space gave way to closeness. Others never crossed that bridge. The chamber remained untouched. The couple lived as companions or as distant cohabitants. Children might be adopted. Love in the romantic sense might never bloom, and yet the marriage held out of duty custom or quiet acceptance. No one ever celebrated these stories. They weren't carved into lacquered boxes or sung at wedding banquets. But they happened. They made up the quiet undercurrent of a world obsessed with ritual. And they remind us that for every tale of wine-stained sheets and dragon-carved bedposts there were nights when the only thing shared was breath. No less human, just less noisy. So the next time you imagine a wedding chamber wrapped in silk and firelight, remember that not every bed was touched. Not every candle burned for passion. Some glowed softly for restraint, for patience, for lives that began with space and chose not to fill it. By the time the red veil was lifted and the wedding wine had been sipped, most couples believed the formalities were behind them. But in many corners of ancient China there remained one final tradition, equal parts folklore theatre and subtle anxiety, the so-called test for an auspicious match. Unlike the elaborate matchmaking charts and fortune-teller consultations that preceded the wedding, this test happened after the couple entered the chamber. It wasn't written down. It wasn't publicly acknowledged. But its results, whispered the next morning, could shape how the family and sometimes the entire village saw the couple's future. This post-wedding test took many forms depending on the region, class and family superstition. In some households it was as simple as watching whether the red wedding candle burned evenly. If one wick flickered more than the other, it was said to suggest imbalance, perhaps the bride would dominate or the groom would stray. In wealthier homes the candles were weighed before being lit, measured in careful grams of wax, as though marriage could be forecast like weather. The helpful matron, stationed somewhere discreet, kept mental notes. Too much smoke, she might mutter, could mean discord. Other households preferred omens of the animal variety. Crickets were popular, kept in tiny bamboo cages placed beneath the marriage bed or near the incense stand. If the cricket sang clearly through the night, the match was declared harmonious. If it remained silent or worse, escaped people exchanged uneasy glances. One story tells of a wedding where the cricket died before midnight. The couple was advised to perform a second ceremony the next day to revive the fate. The bride complied. The groom, apparently suspicious of bugs predicting his love life, did not. In some areas, fire played a larger role. After the couple entered the room, a small clay pot was lit in the corner, a flame meant to represent their shared spirit. The pot was sealed with a lid and left overnight. If smoke still rose in the morning when the lid was removed, the marriage was declared full of life. If the fire had died, the chamber fell into hushed reassurances and quickly offered joss sticks. Some families tried to cheat this test by using oil instead of dry herbs. Others simply said it's only symbolic while peeking through the doorway with hopeful eyes. Water was another popular element in these tests. A shallow dish filled with fresh petals and floating candles might be left beside the bed. If the candles drifted together by dawn, the marriage was blessed. If they floated apart, someone usually blamed the angle of the floorboards. One unusually poetic legend from the Tang dynasty tells of a couple whose dish overturned in the night. When questioned, the bride said they had kicked it over in their sleep while chasing dreams. It was considered such a clever recovery that her family rewarded her with extra dowry linens. Some families employed food as their fortune teller. A bowl of sticky rice with 2 silver chopsticks was placed on the nightstand. In the morning, if both chopsticks leaned gently against the same side of the bowl, the couple would be leaning toward each other in life. If they stood awkwardly apart, well, not ideal. And if one fell, that was taken seriously. There's an old phrase, when the chopstick falls, so may the peace of the house. Practical brides were known to prop the utensils against the rim to ensure their alignment. Not dishonest, just preventive feng shui. And then there were the dreams. Elders believed that what the bride and groom dreamed on the first night carried meaning. If they both dreamt of water, it suggested peace, of fire passion, of falling objects or wild animals, well, best not to mention it aloud. In some families, dream interpretation was considered so crucial that a fortune teller was summoned the next morning. She would sip tea, listen to half-formed dream fragments, and issue pronouncements that hovered somewhere between Confucius and cabaret. One particularly quirky tradition involved a goose feather. Yes, a feather. Placed delicately on the bed before the couple entered, it was said to represent harmony and softness. If by morning the feather remained undisturbed, or in some versions nestled between the couple, it was a sign of gentle unity. If it ended up crushed, crumpled, or somehow relocated to the floor, someone was said to have stepped too heavily into the marriage. In one amusing tale, a feather stuck to the groom's robe as he stood up. The matron interpreted it as he carries the union while his new wife quipped, or he sheds responsibility. Of course, skeptics existed even then. Scholar officials and Confucian conservatives often dismiss such rituals as superstition, distractions from virtue and discipline. They argued that a good marriage was built on respect, not candle wicks and cricket songs. But even they lit the incense. Even they listened quietly, cautiously for the chirp of fate or the whisper of falling petals. Because rituals, however quaint, gave shape to what could not be controlled, the unknown future shared between two strangers now bound beneath one roof. Importantly, the tests weren't always about romantic success. Sometimes they were interpreted economically. The rice clumped prosperity, or agriculturally, the pot cracked bad planting year. In a world where marriage was tightly woven with household function, family fortune, and clan stability, the night's signs rippled outward. The couple's behaviour, the objects in the room, even the wind that slipped through the window, all were potential signals. Nothing was ordinary, everything whispered, but not all tests were grim. In certain areas, elders stage mock failures, shifting the candles, replacing the floating petals, just to see how the couple handled bad omens. Would they blame each other, laugh, pretend not to notice? It was said that how they reacted mattered more than the test itself. One bride who knocked over the rice bowl reportedly laughed and said, "Well, at least we won't be hungry for conversation." She was adored from that moment forward. So while the world outside slept, while the chamber's silence deepened, and the last drops of wine dried on the lacquered tray, a quiet kind of theatre unfolded. One not of passion or poetry, but of signs, symbols, and soft glances toward flickering candles. Because in ancient China, love might have begun with red veils and ritual bows, but it was the feather, the flame, and the floating flower that told everyone whether it would last. It wasn't just hearts that burned on some wedding nights, sometimes the entire chamber did. In rare, unforgettable moments scattered across the scrolls of history and whispered through generations, wedding chambers in ancient China quite literally caught fire. Whether by accident, mischief, or divine intervention, depending on who told the tale, these nights turned from ceremonial warmth to sudden chaos lit not by passion but by flame. The red curtains flared brighter than intended, the phoenix embroidery smouldered at the edges, and the silk bedding curled into ash before the marriage had a chance to warm up. Nothing ends a first kiss like the smell of burning lacquer. Most of these fires were accidents. Too many candles, too much fabric, and a nervous groom with shaky hands. Ancient wedding chambers were dressed to ignite silk hangings from ceiling to floor. Dried floral offerings scattered around incense burners and long-sleeved robes that brushed too close to open flame. Candles, often symbolic dragon and phoenix pairs, were placed at every corner of the room for good luck. But good luck is slippery when one candle topples onto a woven mat, or when a breeze from a careless window stirs a curtain too close to heat. The flames didn't care for symbolism. One well-known tale from the Southern Song dynasty recounts a groom so determined to make a strong first impression that he lit an extra dozen candles around the chamber. The room glowed like a temple. The bride entered her face flushed with the warmth and not entirely with delight. Minutes later, a heavily embroidered red curtain caught fire. Guests heard the commotion, and before the couple could even share wine, they were outside in their wedding finery, watching smoke rise into the sky. The chamber survived. The marriage reportedly did too, though the matron insisted on a second ceremony to get it right this time. Not all fires were accidents. In certain rare darker cases, flames were lit on purpose by rejected suitors, disgruntled relatives, or even the bride herself. There's the infamous tale of Lady Wei, a woman forced into an arranged marriage at age 17. Locked in a gilded chamber with a husband twice her age, and a matron who wouldn't stop humming, she waited until the house quieted. Then she lit a bundle of prayer paper, not in offering, but in defiance. The bedding caught first. The curtain next. No one was harmed, but the message burned clearly: "You cannot cage me in silk." Fires, however tragic, quickly took on symbolic weight. In popular superstition, a chamber fire could mean the marriage was cursed, or conversely that it had been purified. Some believed the flames scared away lingering spirits, burning old karma before a new life could begin. Others thought it was a sign from ancestors, a warning perhaps, or a test. Families responded differently. Some doused. The room laughed nervously and told guests the marriage would be extra passionate. Others took it as a divine no and ended the union before it began. In more conservative families, a chamber fire became a scandal. Investigations followed. Was it sabotage? Was the bride careless? Was the groom drunk? Servants were questioned. The matron was scolded. In one case, a chamber boy was found sleeping with a smouldering stick of incense in his hand, having snuck in to warm himself by a candle. He was quietly dismissed. The bride was quietly pitied. The marriage never quite recovered from the scent of singed symbolism. Palace fires were the most dramatic. In imperial courts, the presence of open flame was already a delicate matter. Fire, though essential for rituals, was tightly regulated. When an imperial wedding chamber caught fire during the Ming dynasty, allegedly due to a servant tripping over a lantern, dozens of eunuchs were punished. The emperor, who was not even in the room yet, declared it an inauspicious omen and postponed the wedding by 99 days. The bride, whose elaborate headdress melted in the panic, was sent back to her family for spiritual cleansing. Whether she ever returned is unknown, yet amidst the destruction there were also stories of unexpected closeness. One couple in rural Fujian reportedly bonded for life after escaping a chamber fire together. They held hands, tripped over a low brazier, and rolled out of the room wrapped in half-burned bedding. Villagers laughed, the matron fainted, and someone still managed to salvage the wedding cake. The couple retold the story, every anniversary calling themselves the fireproof pair. Sometimes it takes a blaze to burn away everything else but the person standing next to you. Some communities developed rituals to prevent such disasters. Water basins were placed discreetly in the corners of the room. Fireproof talismans painted with red ink on yellow paper were hung over the door. Brides were trained not to wear extra long sleeves. Grooms were warned not to overpour the wine near flames, and if someone sneezed too close to a candle, the matron would hiss like a snake and blow it out herself. The chamber might be hot with symbolism, but no one wanted it literally ablaze. In literary circles, the chamber fire became a metaphor used in poetry to speak of doomed love, transformative suffering, or burning away illusions. The bridal bed was ash, but the heart was fire, one poet wrote. Another penned, her veil caught flame, and so did his pride. These stories lived on not just in rumour, but in ink embroidered into brocade scrolls and sung in tea houses. They reminded people that even the most controlled ritual could collapse into chaos, and sometimes it was beautiful. So if you picture an ancient Chinese wedding chamber glowing with candlelight, imagine just for a moment that the light flickers too hard. A curtain breathes in, then out. The flame kisses fabric. And suddenly all the quiet expectations and rehearsed rituals are gone, replaced by breathless urgency and the rush of air footsteps shouts. Love in that moment becomes simple, run, hold on, survive. The bed doesn't matter. The bedding can be replaced, but the person running beside you, that's the one worth burning for. Despite all the silk, all the ceremony, and all the incense swirling like stage smoke, not every bride chose to stay. Some nights ended not in shared wine or whispered words, but in the rush of footsteps, a lifted hem, and a sudden gust of air as the window creaked open. These were the chambers that didn't just host a wedding, they hosted an escape. Because in ancient China, where honour was everything and obedience was embroidered into every stitch, slipping away into the night took courage, and a very quiet landing. The window may have been small, but for some it was the only exit left. These escapes weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they were slow calculated and mournfully quiet. A bride might notice during the long hours of waiting and watching that no one was guarding the window, that the curtain hung just loose enough, that the helpful matron had fallen asleep, and maybe, just maybe, that the husband, though kind, was not the one she wanted. Or worse, he was someone she'd been warned about. A cruel tongue, a violent temper, a face she'd seen once in passing and never wanted to see again. In a society where arranged marriage was the norm and divorce was nearly impossible, especially for women, running away was both desperate and rebellious. But it happened. Sometimes the bride climbed out alone, sometimes she had help. A trusted maid, a sympathetic cousin. In the most daring cases, a former lover hiding beneath the bridal palanquin, now waiting outside with a rope ladder, and a very bad plan. The stories were hushed, the details inconsistent, but the message was always the same. The red veil could also become a red flag. Symbolism surrounded the act. Windows in Chinese architecture were often seen as liminal spaces, portals between in and out, seen and unseen. To flee through one was to cross more than just physical space. It was a rejection of duty, of family, of ancestral alignment. Yet to the fleeing bride, it was often a choice between one kind of death and another. Life as a ghost wife in a loveless home, or life as an outlaw in her own name. Neither choice came with silk bedding or dragon embroidery. Many escape attempts occurred just before the veil was lifted, when the chamber was still tense, ceremonial, and full of red light, but no real intimacy. Some left even earlier, right after the wine, but before the candles were extinguished. Others waited until the entire household was asleep, slipping their fingers beneath the window latch and tiptoeing over polished floorboards that betrayed every sound. There's a tale from the northern provinces of a bride who left behind a single embroidered shoe, half Cinderella, half fugitive. The groom found it in the morning sitting neatly by the curtain. She, of course, was never seen again. Escape wasn't always the end of the story. Some brides returned weeks later, dragged back by brothers or found in remote temples disguised as nuns. Others wrote letters begging forgiveness or explaining their reasons in elegant calligraphy with tear-stained edges. Few married the men they ran to. Fewer still were accepted back. In some merciful households the event was buried quite literally. The bedding burned, the matron dismissed, the window frame quietly replaced, and the bride's name was never spoken again, as if erasing her could restore the family's honour. Yet even among conservative elders some part of the heart understood. After all, many of them had sat in that same red chamber decades earlier, wondering if the man sitting beside them would be friend, stranger or warden. They had felt the walls pressing in, the candles' heat, the pressure of being watched even in silence. Not everyone acted, but everyone perhaps had thought about the window. And let's not forget the coded signs. A folded corner on the bedding, a red sash tied in a knot only a certain friend would recognise, a small ink dot on the wooden window sill. In the most coordinated escapes, a servant or old nursemaid might be in on the plan, accidentally leaving the window unlatched or placing the stool just right. These subtle gestures of solidarity were dangerous. Helping a bride escape could mean exile, beatings, or worse. But loyalty sometimes beat out fear. There's even a whispered tradition about the window knot, a practice so quiet it never made it into official texts. Before the wedding, some brides tied a tiny knot inside the hem of their sleeve. If untied on the wedding night, it meant acceptance. If left tied, it meant resistance. And if she used it to hook the window latch open, it meant she was going to run. No words spoken. Just a thread of silk and a breath held in the dark. Of course, some escapes failed. A foot slipped, a guard stirred, a door creaked open at the wrong moment. One story tells of a bride who made it as far as the garden wall before tripping on her heavy robe and falling into a koi pond. She was fished out by the groom himself, who, depending on which version you hear, either forgave her or locked the chamber forevermore. Either way, the koi were said to be very startled. In literature, these fleeing brides became tragic heroines or cautionary tales. Poems were written from the perspective of the abandoned groom or the defiant girl. She leapt into moonlight, not knowing if there was ground, one line reads. Another says, "The chamber held my body, but the window knew my name." These verses were sometimes carved into fan blades or painted discreetly into bridal chests, a quiet nod to those who had longed for something beyond ceremony. So next time you imagine a wedding night in ancient China, remember the red curtain fluttering by the window, the hush of slippers across wooden floors, the quiet click of a latch. Not every bride stayed, not every match was blessed, and sometimes the most honest moment in the whole marriage was the one where she chose to climb, not kneel. There were wedding nights in ancient China that never really ended. Nights that stretched long beyond the silk drapes and candle wax suspended in time, not because of joy, but because of sorrow, silence, or something no one could quite explain. The chamber remained, the bed remained, but the laughter never came. In some houses the air itself seemed to grow heavy, as if mourning the ritual that had taken place or the one that never would. Sometimes it wasn't just the bride or groom who disappeared, it was the feeling of life from the room itself. The stories began softly shared in whispers among maids folding sheets, or old men lighting lamps, of chambers where the bride fell ill on the wedding night, and never rose again, her body still draped in red like a doll half unwrapped. Or the groom who drank too much celebration wine, fell asleep beside his new wife and never woke up. The room was sealed for days, then opened with incense and prayers, but no one stayed long after that. They say even the walls began to warp with time as if the room was holding its breath. In other cases, it wasn't death, but something more ghostly. Brides who simply stopped speaking after the ceremony, grooms who refused to return to the marital bed. One famous tale tells of a couple who entered the wedding chamber and emerged a month later, never having touched one another, though no one could explain why. The red candles burned to the stumps, the wine dried in its cup, but no sheets were stained, no clothing was torn. Historians still debate whether this was rebellion, mental collapse, or a quiet pact of mutual resistance. Some chambers became altars. When a young wife died before her time, her room was preserved just as it was. The bedding unwashed, her hair comb left beside the mirror, the bed untouched, a shrine to the life she never lived. Visitors came not to mourn a long marriage, but to witness a night that never moved forward. In some families, the practice of keeping the wedding chamber intact for years was seen as a filial, piety proof that the departed was never forgotten. Others called it superstition, but no one denied the eeriness. There were also rooms that turned into prisons, where a bride rejected or dishonoured was locked away with no visitors. The crimson silk faded into dusty pinks, and the celebratory symbols on the walls turned into reminders of something unfinished. A brushstroke of phoenix feathers that once meant fertility now looked like flames licking the corners of the bed frame. In these stories, food was passed through a slot in the door. Messages were left under pillows. And outside, life moved on slowly but stubbornly, while inside, time folded in on itself. And of course, there were chambers that hosted both a wedding and a funeral. The incense from the celebration still hung in the air as new sticks were lit to honour the dead. In some regions, when a bride died on the wedding night, her dowry was buried with her. Silk fans, hairpins, a mirror, a tiny embroidered shoe, and sometimes the groom was expected to mourn her as a husband of decades despite knowing her for only a single hour. A wedding that became a memorial before the sheets cooled. There's something particularly unsettling about an unfinished beginning. A ceremony designed to mark the start of something love lineage shared breath that instead marked an ending. That's why some wedding chambers, especially in aristocratic houses, were sealed entirely after tragedy, boarded up behind folding screens, curtains left drawn for decades. Some were said to creak in the night. Others remained perfectly still, as if even the dust had agreed to stop moving out of respect. Legends formed around these spaces, of brides who never left their chambers because their spirits didn't know the night had ended, of husbands who returned years later speaking to the silence as if it still answered. Some claimed that if you entered such a chamber and sat in the exact spot where the bride once waited, you could feel a warmth beneath the mattress. Not frightening, just persistent, like a breath that never got to finish exhaling. In rare cases, entire houses were abandoned after such nights. Too much grief, too many questions. One story from the late Ming period speaks of a wealthy merchant whose daughter died on her wedding night. He sealed the chamber and relocated the entire family to another province. Years later, villagers swore the red curtains still shifted in the wind, though the windows were nailed shut. And the bed, they said, still smelled faintly of camphor and orchid powder. Of course, not every never-ending night was tragic. In some quieter households, the couple remained so bonded by their wedding night that they preserved the chamber exactly as it had been. They never moved the bed, never replaced the candles. They celebrated every anniversary not with banquets, but with a quiet return to the same room now creased with memory. In these rare cases, the chamber wasn't frozen. It was simply timeless, a place where time didn't matter because love had already made the moment eternal. But most often the wedding chamber was simply left behind, after the candles burned out and the guests had left, after the wine had dried and the songs had faded. It became a guest room, a storage space, or just another room with red wallpaper and no particular story to tell, except to those who knew, those who remembered. because every wedding night in ancient China came with the weight of history, and sometimes the night simply refused to end. And now we slow down. The curtains no longer shimmer with candlelight. The laughter from the courtyard has long since faded. The red silk lies still undisturbed, resting like a petal on a pond. The wedding chamber, once tense with ritual and expectation, is now quiet, not with dread, but with release. The air cools gently, as if someone opened a window not to flee, but to breathe. You're not in a palace or a peasant's hut. You're simply here in the soft aftermath of ceremony, where stories rest, where footsteps have stopped, and where even the furniture sighs. Let the room dim around you. Let the fabric of the night settle without edges. This was a journey through chambers hidden behind paper walls and faded dreams, but here now there is no veil, no witness, just stillness. Close your eyes. Let the memory of silk slip through your fingers. The story has folded itself away.